The new mandatory living wage has come into force in the United Kingdom, which requires employers to pay workers aged 25 and over at least £7.20 per hour. It is expected to give 1.8 million workers, with further people being phased in the coming years. Those working between the ages of 21 and 24 will continue to be paid the current national minimum wage of £6.70 an hour. The policy was announced in last summer's emergency budget by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. Speaking in Parliament at the time, the Chancellor said the living wage would be implemented in an effort to ease burdens on the cost of living and create what he called a higher wage, lower welfare economy.
Britain deserves a pay rise, and Britain is getting a pay rise. I am today introducing a new national living wage. We will set it to reach £9 an hour by 2020.
Some 1.3 million workers in the United Kingdom are currently paid the minimum wage, while a further 500,000 people who earn slightly more than it will also benefit.
Now, joining me to discuss this new pay rise is Annie Quick from the New Economics Foundation, and she works in social and economic inequalities, and Ryan Bourne, who's Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Annie, it's limited enough, isn't it? It doesn't cover younger workers. A number of European countries have got higher minimum wages.
Well, exactly. So we're certainly welcoming this as a step in the right direction, but I'm afraid it's quite dishonest, actually, to call this a living wage. So we have a living wage in the UK. It's calculated very carefully by academics for the Living Wage Foundation, and it's based crucially on the actual cost of living. And that living wage comes out at £9.40 in London and £8.25 in the rest of the country. So that's significantly above the £7.20 that George Osborne has introduced. And what that means is that even after this policy is introduced, we're still going to be in a position where the UK, which is one of the richest countries in the world, remember, still has people working and yet not making enough to live on. So, you know, much more work to be done here.
Ryan, what this tells us really is that the UK economy is a too low wage economy, doesn't it?
Well, let me just come back on that first point. I mean, the idea that employers are supposed to pay people to cover their rent and fuel bills as opposed to pay them for the work that they actually do strikes me as a very weird economic concept. I have no idea what the rent or what the fuel bills or what the childcare costs
well, I guess
have anything to do with.
I guess the point would be, Ryan, I guess the point would be is that workers who come in who can't afford to eat and are homeless aren't very good workers.
Certainly true, but let's look at some of the underlying causes for why some of these things are so expensive in the first place. And then perhaps, rather than politicians lamenting that companies don't pay enough, they might look a bit closer to home.
Why should people who can't afford to pay decent wages be in business? They shouldn't be in business.
It depends what's a decent wage. Look, let's look at some of the underlying causes for high cost of things.
Ryan,
let's look at
is this above your wages?
High cost of housing is a result of government planning restrictions. A. B, the high cost of energy, at least in part, is due to deliberate high energy cost policies which have been implemented to stop climate change. 2. Third, childcare. We've had extremely heavy regulation of childcare introduced in the last 10 years. Now, these things come with consequences, and politicians can either row back on some of the things that they're doing which are driving up the cost of living in the first place, or you know, they're going to have to do something like this living wage. And I think the problem with the living wage is that it really does restrict opportunities to get onto the jobs ladder for some of the lowest skilled and most vulnerable workers. And nobody seems to be talking about them today. 60,000 people estimated fewer to be employed by 2020, and they've got no voice in politics whatsoever.
That's an old story, isn't it, Annie? I mean, since we stopped children going up chimneys, people have been complaining that Labour legislation would damage jobs. Is there any truth in it?
Well, exactly. So the real issue facing small businesses at the moment is demand. So the kind of the idea that there will be job losses as a result of this legislation coming in is based on the idea that if you're a business, in order to pay higher wages, you then have to make people redundant. And that might be the case if George Osborne was picking out 2 or 3 businesses and then saying that they had to pay higher wages. But you've got to look at the economy as a whole here. So what happens when all businesses pay higher wages is that those people, those employees, have more money to spend. They go out into the economy, they spend their money, and that increases demand. And as I say, what we've got at the moment in the UK is a crisis of demand. So anything that increases demand will be good for businesses in the longer term.
Ryan, on your approach, is there any wage that's too low?
Well, clearly,
I mean,
at the
is
moment,
£5 too low, or £3, or £2 an hour? Is that too low?
Well, I'm trying to answer the question if you let me answer. Well, at the moment, the lowest wage that people can get is no wage, and that's the wage that you get if you're unemployed and having to rely on benefits from government. And according to the government's own estimates, 60,000 people more are going to find themselves unemployed by 2020 as a result of this policy. Now, one of the consequences, actually, of our increasing minimum wage over the years has been the use of more and more zero-hours contracts and more unpaid internships. So we can pretend that, there's nobody out there.
I'm struggling here. I'm struggling here. I mean, I'm giving you enough time to answer a different question, but I'm a bit struggling here about what your answer was to the question I asked you. Is there a wage that's too low?
Well, I think if somebody is willing to work and an employer is willing to pay them to work, then that's a mutually beneficial decision by definition.
So that's
from
a no,
those two
then?
individuals.
That's a no, then?
If I could just come back on that, what he's just described there is essentially a race to the bottom, where everybody is paying lower and lower wages in order to compete. And we saw exactly the same kind of thing when we introduced the national minimum wage in the late 1990s. There was loads of scare stories. It was predicted that 1 million jobs would be lost as a result of bringing in the national minimum wage. Researchers looking back, no such adverse effects occurred. So the national minimum wage now is something that everyone would agree is a really important basic wage floor it makes sure that everybody's paid at least that much.
Ryan, every time somebody tries to regulate the labour market, somebody comes forward with the kind of argument that you've been putting ever since we stopped children going up chimneys or limited the length of the working day. But the terrible consequences never seem to really come true.
Well, you go to France and some other countries and see youth unemployment and then see whether it comes true. Look, some of the economics we've heard here today is just extraordinary economics. Who knew that it was so easy to regulate ourselves into prosperity by mandating higher wages? If only all the people in Africa realised this, they'd all introduce higher minimum wages and everybody would be prosperous because there'd be more demand. I mean, this is the economics. This is junk economics, terrible economics. And, some of the sort of questions you're asking me is exactly the problem with this debate. You seem to be suggesting that if somebody's not in favour of the government mandating something, then they don't care about it. Now, I care about the job prospects of those 60,000 people who are less likely to be able to find work as a result of this policy. They're some of the lowest skilled, most vulnerable workers who would find it difficult to get their feet on the jobs ladder in that first job. And I'd much prefer to be talking about them and what we can do to improve their life chances rather than concentrating on lifting the pay of people in work.
So jobs at any cost?
As I say, this idea that there's a trade-off between the pay, the minimum wage, and the number of jobs is just not based on evidence. So he said, who knew we could regulate our way out of low pay? And the answer is anybody who's looked at the research. So we've got in the UK, we've got the introduction of the national minimum wage. We've also got a very rigorous, good quality and highly regarded study by Princeton University professors looking at the introduction of wage floors in different states in the US that found not only that it didn't create unemployment, but actually that it increased unemployment because, as I say, the effect that this has on demand. We know that those who are paid less generally spend a higher proportion of their income. So what it means is that if you redistribute income, if businesses are forced to redistribute income from their higher paid workers to their lower paid workers and increase their wages, then we end up with a stronger economy. So it's a real win-win here. It's a win-win for employees, it's a win-win for businesses, and it's a win-win for a healthier economy.
Ryan, that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, the Netherlands has got a higher minimum wage than Britain, and its labour productivity is 20% higher. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's lots of reasons why average productivity might be higher other than the minimum wage. But look, if you want to go down the French route of higher productivity, because France has got higher productivity too, they have higher average productivity just because they essentially mandate that many low-skilled workers aren't able to work. Now, okay, on the official measures, that might look like higher productivity, but I think I'd much rather live in a country where more people are in work, because I actually do believe that work has a lot of external social benefits as well.
So it's always going to result in unemployment?
Certainly not, as I say, the evidence doesn't suggest that. But I think it's a good point that work is good for people, and it certainly is. We wouldn't deny that. The unemployment figure is one of the most important things that the government should always be looking at. But there's more than just having a job. The research suggests, and when you talk to people, what's important to them is not just having any job, but having a good job. And that means not just having a job with good pay, but also having a job with higher security, moving away from things like zero-hour contracts. So I think it's absolutely right that the government, rather than constantly only focusing on unemployment, is also having a broader and more rounded approach to good jobs. And as I say, this is a small step in the right direction, but there's much more that can be done in terms of industrial strategy, in terms of supporting sectors, and having a much more hands-on, more leadership approach.
Annie, do you think politically that there's anything that could knock this back now that it's been instituted? I mean, for instance, there's much talk about another recession heading around the corner. There's the possibility of instability because of the European referendum. Any of these things likely to reverse a policy like this?
Well, that's always a danger, and that's one of the reasons that we say that as well as having individual government regulations such as this one, it's also really important that we build strong unions across businesses, and then unions can continue to advocate on the part of their workers, regardless of who's in power and what the kind of political priorities of the day are.
Ryan, this was brought in by a Tory government. Do you see anybody in the political spectrum who represents the kind of view that you've been advocating that might reverse this measure?
Well, I think a lot of Conservative MPs have very severe reservations, but are towing the party line and concentrating on other issues at the moment. And I actually think, talking to a lot of commentators and economists who write for national newspapers, I've been quite surprised by just how muted the reaction to this policy has been today. I think a lot of people do realise that this is a very dangerous gamble, and not just because of the huge increase in the minimum wage itself over the next 5 years, but also in the changing of the institution. We've gone from a situation where an independent low-pay commission has set this at arm's length from politics, and now we've completely politicised this. And the fail-safe for this is supposed to be that if we hit a recession, the living wage will be revised down because it will be a fixed proportion of median earnings. I can envisage no scenario in which the Chancellor of the Exchequer will stand up in Parliament and lower people's nominal wages for about 18% of the private sector workforce in a recession. So I think this has got hugely problematic implications for low-skilled workers, and I think that will only actually get worse when we hit the bad times. So I don't think you'll see the full effect of this until we hit the next recession.
Annie, do you think one of the reasons why the criticism of it might have been muted and why those Tory backbenchers went along with it is that it's almost impossible, given the growing gap between the rich and the poor, to make a case against it? I mean, Ryan's given it his best shot, but...
Absolutely, I think that's absolutely right. People have an instinctive belief that we need to reduce inequality in the UK, but also there's so many good economic arguments for reducing inequality. And this isn't some crazy people, some crazy radicals with this idea. This, the World Bank, the OECD, many people are coming out repeatedly saying inequality is harming our economy, and one of the ways that we can deal with that is to increase low wages. But I'm glad that a recession was brought up, because that's one other aspect that we need to think about here. So the recession was caused by unsustainable increases in household debt. Now, household debt is increasing now almost to the rates that we saw before the recession, and much of that is because of low-paid work. So this increase in pay isn't just a nice-to-have for some people who are finding life a bit tough. It's also essential for building a stronger and safer economy so that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past.
OK. Ryan Bourne and Annie Quick from the New Economics Foundation, thanks very much for joining us, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this part of the programme. Do rejoin us for the final part of the show. We'll be looking at Turkish President Erdogan's visit to the United States as part of a nuclear security summit. He faces criticism at home for clamping down on critical voices. Do stay with us.